So welcome to the Exposing Exclusion panel. Of course, we've already exposed quite a bit of exclusion here today with the aid of our previous panelists, but we promise a different spin on it, on this now familiar topic. So all of us on this panel, in our own way, are educators, so I want to quickly introduce the panel by talking a little bit about education. And I wanted to start with a personal anecdote. Before I started teaching here at the GSD, I taught at the Maryland Institute College of Art. My students there were overwhelmingly white. MICA is in a neighborhood called Bolton Hill, which is white too. Interestingly, it is surrounded on all sides by neighborhoods that are not white. So you may have seen these judgmental maps. This is one of Baltimore. There's one of St. Louis as well. I didn't make it. So here's MICA indicated by art nerds. And zooming in, you see it's surrounded by nothing but trouble, drugs and prostitutes, and The Wire. So here's a typical block in art nerds. Here's one in Nothing But Trouble, and here's one in The Wire. So the first class I ever taught at MICA in 2005, it was a survey class, and it looked at the policies that have shaped cities in the United States. And since the class focused on race, I thought we should start by looking at Bolton Hill. Why was it so white compared to the neighborhoods around it? Why was it so wealthy, and why did it look so different? These are pretty basic questions, actually, and by now we have some pretty basic answers to all of them. We know that racial segregation was the product of dozens of local, state, federal policies aimed at creating two Americas, separate but unequal. We've learned a lot about that today. I don't have to, I think we've seen this slide 4 times now. It's a powerful one. But of course, there's racial zoning, there's redlining, there's, freeway construction, white men's roads through black men's homes, urban renewal, what James Baldwin famously called Negro removal, suburban incorporation, which led to what has been called a white suburban noose around cities, racial covenants, which we all know about by now. These defined who could and could not live in a house, racist codes of ethics that real estate brokers swore to uphold. For example, they forbid brokers from introducing inharmonious elements. So it wasn't that difficult, right, to explain why the neighborhoods outside the MICA bubble were so different. But the point I want to make now is that students actually had to be asked to ask these questions. I think for most students, the way things were in Bolton Hill and its surroundings was unremarkable. It's just sort of the way things were. And I think this has to do with, this was the first class a lot of students were exposed to exclusion. And I think in some ways it's because until very recently, exclusion and segregation were thought to be problems that were problems from the past. Cheryl Cashin in 2004's Failures of Integration wrote about integration fatigue. Xavier D'Souza Briggs, in the introduction to 2005's Geography of Opportunity, wrote that racial segregation has, as a public concern, receded into memory for most Americans. The racial desegregation agenda is old news because the problem, they believe, has long been solved. And then 2016, we can certainly agree that not enough measures are taken to address these issues, but we can probably also agree that the past few years have seen more and more exposés about segregation and exclusion. I suspect more people, for example, are reading Colin Gordon's amazing book now than when it was published in 2008. And of course, it was the uprisings in Ferguson, catalyzed by the police shooting of Michael Brown, that helped dispel the myth of a post-racial Obama-era America and helped renew interest in segregation and exclusion. Autopsies of those uprisings, which often dwell a lot on Gordon's book, have effectively demonstrated the degree to which white supremacy continues to shape our urban environments. Let's hope that the renewed conversations around race and place that have emerged in the wake of the uprisings lead to a renewed effort to remove barriers to access and build more integrated, equitable cities. Here we have 4 individuals on this panel, all from St. Louis, who in their own way are doing exactly that, in part by telling stories about the lived experience of people in their home city, using data, using activism, journalism, art, filmmaking, and other means. It's really my honor to welcome them here to Harvard. So we'll start Dr. Jason Purnell, assistant professor at WashU's Brown School of Public Health, graduate of Harvard University, welcome back, and trained in applied psychology and public health. His research focuses on how socioeconomic and sociocultural factors influence health. So today he's going to talk about For the Sake of All, an initiative that he is currently leading. Denise Ward-Brown is associate professor at Washington University, also a filmmaker, screenwriter, internationally exhibited sculptor, whose art frequently explores African and African-American themes and history. Today, Denise is going to talk about A Tale of Two Cities, Documenting Our Divides, which is a course that she teaches at WashU about art as activism. Catalina Freitas is an architect and urban designer, assistant professor at WashU's Sam Fox School, where she teaches design studios and seminars with a focus on sustainable design. And today she's going to talk about Segregation by Design, a historical analysis of the impact of planning and policy in St. Louis, cross-university transdisciplinary undergraduate seminar that she is presently teaching. So last but not least, Sylvester Brown, a writer, journalist, and self-described change agent. Has been a Metro columnist with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, a consultant for Smiley Books, a founder of many nonprofits, including most recently the amazing Sweet Potato Project. It's just called the Sweet Potato Project, but it is amazing. A summer program aimed at teaching at-risk youth entrepreneurial skills. Today, Sylvester is going to talk about becoming a doer, how 30 years of writing about race and exclusion fueled Project for Change. Sylvester will also serve as a respondent, so I'm going to ask him to respond for a couple minutes after the four panels. Please join me in welcoming our very distinguished guest. And with that, I would like to invite Dr. Jason Purnell to the podium. Just press that.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction. As Dan mentioned, this is kind of two worlds colliding. I find myself back at Harvard talking about St. Louis, and it's an honor to be here to talk to you a little bit about a project called For the Sake of All, which started in March of 2013 with funding from the Missouri Foundation for Health, a collaboration of scholars from Washington University and St. Louis University, in an attempt to talk about health disparities in a different way, to talk about the social and economic and environmental factors that drive health outcomes and health disparities, particularly as they impact African Americans as one of the more vulnerable populations, and also to talk about the economic impact of those disparities on the St. Louis community, and to change the conversation around health disparities and social determinants of health beyond just delivering more and better medical care, people taking more personal responsibility, but really looking at the context in which health happens. So we released a report in May of 2014 after having released 5 policy briefs between August and December of 2013, looking at factors like poverty and education and income, residential segregation, how all of those things impacted health. And I'm just going to show you some highlights really quickly from that report. This is easily the most famous graphic from the For the Sake of All report. And what folks have really focused on is the 18-year gap in life expectancy at birth between the zip code 63106 in North St. Louis City and 63105 in the Clayton area, which is very near Washington University's campus. And when it was mentioned that we have some of the most wealthy suburbs in the St. Louis metropolitan area, Clayton would certainly rank among the wealthiest in the nation. By the way, that's a geography that's separated by less than 10 miles. An 18-year gap in life expectancy at birth. So health and life and the factors that support health and life are not equally distributed in the St. Louis region. And this series of maps drills down on that notion. This is a map of African American population in St. Louis City and County, which should now be a familiar geography. You've seen this map several times now. But the orange is the highest concentration, anywhere from 45 to 97% African American. The light blue is 6 to 44%. The dark blue is 1 to 5%. This is a map of concentration of poverty by zip code in St. Louis City and County. Again, the orange is the highest, 19 to 54%. Light blue is 9 to 18%. Dark blue is 1 to 8%. So these are the social factors. This is a mapping of the social factors. The next two maps are health outcomes overlaid on those social factors. These are heart disease death rates, or what we call heart cardiovascular mortality in public health. Same color schemes where orange is the highest, light blue is moderate, dark blue is the lowest. And these are cancer mortality rates. And the purpose here is not to tell a causal story where map 1 causes map 2, causes map 3, causes map 4. It's to overlay these maps on top of one another and notice where the orange stays orange, where the light blue stays light blue, and where the dark blue stays dark blue. Health and life are not equally distributed in the St. Louis region. Now, when I teach this to my students, I make them guess what percentages go into the pie chart. What most people are most surprised to learn is that of the contributors to premature death in the United States, medical care only contributes about 10%, even though we spend about 18% of our $17 trillion economy on healthcare. The largest slice of that pie by far is behavior. And when we talk about behavior, we're talking about things like maintaining a healthy weight, eating a healthy diet, engaging in regular physical activity, and refraining from smoking. But what we know in public health is that those behaviors aren't just about personal responsibility. Those behaviors happen in a context. And as part of that context, only 39% of African Americans who live in the city of St. Louis consider their neighborhood to be safe. And only 66% of African Americans who live in the city of St. Louis find it easy to buy healthy food. So when folks like me in public health talk about that 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity and 5 to 7 fruits and vegetables, if you don't consider it safe, you're not going out for that walk after dinner. You're not sending your children out to play. If you have to take 2 buses to find a fresh fruit or vegetable, it's going to be much harder to engage in that behavior. Behavior happens in a context. And just to drill down on that notion of context, this is a map of the availability of quality foods in St. Louis, both the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County. In this case, the orange is poor or no access, the light blue is fair access, the dark blue is good access. You can see that there are entire swaths of St. Louis where it's hard to find quality foods. And you need to think about this map as really the ratio of supermarkets and other high-quality food outlets compared to the availability of McDonald's and Taco Bell's and the other fast food. So there are areas that are saturated with fast food and unhealthy food, and where it's impossible to find healthy food options. Another thing we know in public health is that education is by far one of the strongest and most consistent predictors of health outcomes that we have. This is a map that looks a lot like the African American population map that's showing you the percent African American enrollment by school district in the city and the county combined. And this is a map showing you the percent high school dropout by zip code in the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County. Again, where the color schemes are similar, orange is the highest, light blue is moderate, and dark blue is the lowest. What we also know is that there is a growing gap over the past several decades between the life expectancy of those with high school or less education and those with some college or more. One analysis showed that between 1990 and 2000, those who had high school or less education gained absolutely no years of life expectancy, compared to about a little over a year and a half of life expectancy for those with some college or more. And what we know is that whites in St. Louis are more likely to have some college or more. African Americans are more likely to have high school or less. We also know that in 2012, 1 in 10 African American 9th through 12th graders, roughly 2,000 children, dropped out of school. And if we use third grade language, English language arts proficiency as the fairly reliable and consistent predictor that it is of later outcomes, we can see that an uncomfortable proportion of African American children are on their way to high school dropout. But education is not a panacea. The upshot of this graph is that an African American woman who's done everything right, she's got a college degree or more, is still more likely to deliver a baby at low birth weight than a white woman who hasn't graduated from high school in St. Louis. And this is consistent with data from other communities and national data. And unfortunately, we have an infant mortality rate that goes along with those negative birth outcomes. An African American infant is 3 times more likely to die before their first birthday than a white infant in both the city and the county in St. Louis. We also know that the burden of chronic disease is higher among African Americans. Some of the leading causes of death in terms of chronic disease all have higher mortality rates for African Americans in the city and the county in St. Louis. And there's increasing recognition in public health and other disciplines that violence has to be treated as a public health issue, a public health crisis, really. African Americans have 12 times the homicide death rate of whites in St. Louis City and St. Louis County combined. And I told you that we weren't just interested in telling the health story or the moral story here, we're also looking at the economic impact of all of this. So we were actually able to estimate 2 social factors that lead to death among African American adults in 2011. We were able to estimate that of the 3,100 deaths, roughly, of African Americans 25 years and older in 2011, 305 of those deaths were due to poverty, 263 of those deaths due to having less than high school education, with an economic impact of estimated at $4 billion. We also are able to estimate that if just half of those 2,000 9th through 12th graders who dropped out of school had actually graduated, they would have made $11 million more in income per year. They would have spent $21 million more on home purchases. They would have added $15 million to our gross regional product and added $1.1 million to state and local tax revenues. Those of you who are from St. Louis will understand what I mean when I say this example has become quaint as we considered spending $1 billion on just one football stadium. But we spend $1.1 billion on the treatment of heart disease, cancer, and diabetes in St. Louis. In the old days, that would have bought us 3 football stadiums. And now it will just buy you 1 open-air riverfront stadium. But eliminating the disparity between African Americans and whites on those 3 chronic conditions would save $65 million. Interestingly, African Americans make up roughly 30% of St. Louis City and St. Louis County combined. 42% of hospital charges for mental health treatment are for the treatment of African Americans. African Americans are using hospitals, emergency rooms, inpatient hospitalization for treatment of mental health conditions, which suggests the lack of access to community-based outpatient mental health services. Eliminating that disparity would save between $25 and $27 million. So this has a real economic impact. We have recommendations in 6 major areas for what to do about these lingering disparities in St. Louis. I won't go over them in detail, but suffice it to say that I'm willing to say that in social science, there's not a whole lot that the jury is in on. The jury is in on early childhood. We could stop doing studies today and know that the investment in early childhood makes both economic and social sense. And every child ought to have high quality. The quality is key in that recommendation, high quality early childhood. Creating economic opportunities for families, which includes an idea that was innovated by my colleague at the Brown School, Michael Schraden, called child development accounts. We're recommending that every baby born in the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County receive a $500 college savings account, opt out at birth. Investing in coordinated school health programs, meaning supporting the health and well-being of children before we expect them to perform academically. Investing in the full range of mental health, from awareness to screening to treatment. Surveillance just means we need better data. It's not that we're looking in on your home to see what your mental health looks like. Investing in quality neighborhoods so that it's possible to find a grocery store, safe place to play, a bank, a job, no matter where you live in St. Louis. And that last one is a lot of words that just means that health doesn't happen in hospitals and doctors' offices. It happens in communities, and we have to do a better job of connecting communities to clinical settings in order to deal with chronic disease and other health disparities. So we're in the second phase of this work now. We're continuing to inform the public and policymakers about this work, but also trying to mobilize communities around these recommendations, what we call the grassroots strategy, and also a little bit of the grass top strategy, because we know that there are key actors in the public and private sectors who also need to be activated around this implementation. And of course, we have to determine the impact of this work and whether it can be replicated in other communities. What you're looking at on the left is what we call a community action forum, where we roll out these discussion guides and action toolkits on each of our 6 areas of recommendation, all of which are available on our website. And I'd like to show this. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but there is significant crosstalk between For the Sake of All and our recommendations and what the Ferguson Commission reported last September. And there was always alignment between our work and theirs, and we're continuing to align that action going forward. We brought together in September of last year 60 stakeholders. We asked them to prioritize among the specific recommendations of For the Sake of All. Before they got to the event, we asked them to prioritize them in terms of their importance and their feasibility. They came up with about 34 strategies, which we narrowed down to 8. Those 8 strategies include quality improvement and awareness of early childhood resources, the development accounts I told you about, school-based clinics in areas of high need, a model that was developed by the CDC and an organization called ASCD called Whole School, Whole Community, Whole Child, which is about supporting health and well-being of students in schools, creating a regional mental health data system, advocating for affordable and inclusive housing, treating gun violence as a public health issue, and addressing socioeconomic barriers to health care and expanding the role of community health workers. So in February, last month, we brought together 100 stakeholders, key leaders in multiple sectors, and this was actually co-hosted by Forward Through Ferguson, the organization that has taken up the work of the Ferguson Commission. We had those 8 strategy groups that came up with draft action plans for implementation and next steps in terms of moving forward in a cross-sector collaborative way. There are lots of folks to thank for the work that we're doing in terms of both material resources and partnership across the St. Louis community. And everything I've said to you is available on our website, forthesakeofall.org, and you can follow us on Twitter at @forthesakeofall. Thank you.
Good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank the Harvard Graduate School of Design for inviting me here to share some of my student work. It's a big file, and it's taken a while to open. But I'd like to start off by saying that I'm an artist, I'm a filmmaker, and I'm an activist. And I wanted to say that before the tragic killing of Michael Brown, I was already in the streets of Ferguson and St. Louis filming protests with about 3 different organizations, grassroots organizations. Their campaigns included the bench warrant issue, which was a type of debtor's prison in Ferguson and all the small communities outside of St. Louis. There was the Show Me 15 group of people fighting for higher wages and OBS. So I was already out there doing a variety of filming. And then Mike Brown's killing ignited, I think, a desire for all of the various I think there are about 40 or 50 separate groups, grassroots social justice groups, to come together and fight as one group. All right, sorry. And so one of the things I wanted to do was to mentor and help students to get in touch with those grassroots organizations, to film and to create videos on and about those videos that went along with some of their academic studies, with their research about St. Louis and about social justice. So students began shooting as soon as they were trained on the cameras with the intention to discover their projects in the midst of participation. And here's some raw
But you've got
footage.
generations and generations of disinvestment in our city. St. Louis was once the fourth largest city in the country. At one point, they were talking about making it the capital of the United States. And in a couple of generations, we've reduced it to rubble.
So Bob Hansman, one of my colleagues at Sam Fox, runs tours that all throughout St. Louis. And if you go on one tour, I'd advise you to go on 3 more because the tours are never the same. And he's very vocal. And one of my students, I'll show you later, this student here, pretty much attached himself to Bob for the semester and made an hour-long final presentation, which I'm not going to show you. I'm going to show you about 3 minutes of it. But their charge as students was to participate. And one thing that I've learned in making documentaries myself is participation is absolutely different than going in and observing. We talked about exploitation earlier. How do you avoid that? You avoid that by being a participant and not an observer, making whatever it is you're doing, they're the object. One of the things I've found, I call that experiential research and learning, and I think it's important for artists especially to know how to make authentic statements to participate with the group that they're working with. And I know it's very different than any kind of anthropological research. But the first thing I wanted the students to do is to understand who they were, who they are before, who are they. They need to know how to speak about who they are before they can speak about others. They needed to understand that they themselves had a stake in the research and what was driving that desire to do this research. Also, I wanted them to consider what will it take to put themselves in the timeline of history through the relationship that they developed with the local events. And to be able to do that, they can then make a declarative statement about the truth that they're witnessing and participating in the city. So the first thing I asked them to do was to make a biopic about themselves and why they're interested in social justice. This is an excerpt from Abby Gorbin.
Is there a WashU bubble?
There's a WashU bubble, yeah, definitely.
It's like the WashU bubble is like the first term you hear upon arrival.
Like an invisible barrier.
To me, like initially, it means like having a community.
How I found myself in the WashU bubble.
I applied early decision and the rest is history.
So much in transition, going from high school to college, both environmentally and for me personally, internally, and to have so much change, I needed a constant, and my constant was my little bubble.
A really good benefit is that you're surrounded by so many people who are going through similar things.
That's our
Students definitely feel
chancellor.
comfortable here in general.
While the bubble is a lot of fun, we must pop it sometimes.
Out of the classroom into the street!
Out of the classroom into the street!
Out of the classroom into the street!
Out of the classroom into the streets!
Out of the classroom into the street!
Out of the classroom into the streets!
I don't know that the bubble has necessarily changed, but I think it's the mindset of students that might be changing.
As a student body, we need to stay informed and work to look outside of the WashU bubble while recognizing all that it gives us.
And this is another student from China, Zhenru Mao.
I was born in a small town in the southeast of China. I spent my happy childhood in this nice and simple place. Coming to study in the United States is the largest step in my life so far. Actually, before I came to St. Louis, I had some kind of prejudice about this city. Like, there are many black people and it's not safe. Some friends also share similar feelings with me.
So I guess when I first heard people talking about St. Louis before I came here, I was told that it was pretty segregated, that parts of it where there was a lot of racism. It was like...
So before I came here, I was really excited because it's the first kind of like large city I've lived in the United States. And you know, just by the name, it sounds really romantic, St. Louis.
Some things that have stuck out to me are that the city seems a lot more committed to racial justice than previous places I've lived in, and I think I've noticed that it's a lot more segregated than I thought it would be.
But I never ask why. What leads to the social problem? The tension and conflict caused by racial disparity made me to re-examine the social dynamics, and I gradually learned that it is an unfair and ingrained social structure that deprives people development opportunities. It can be shocking to see two totally different worlds just within few miles distance in the same city. In the meantime, students' campaigns and actions in WashU campus stimulated me to have a new perspective of the major social work and the sense of social responsibility not only as a social work student, but also as a human being. Through the documentary class this semester, I had more opportunities to engage in social practice.
It's time. If we don't get it, shut it down. 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 If we don't get it, shut it down.
I learned that when facing injustice, instead of acceptance, we need to stand up and fight. When you see there are so many ordinary people, no matter their race, age, and gender, striving for justice and rights against a powerful, unfair structure, you feel encouraged. My learning experience at Brown School taught me to put away prejudice, appreciate diversity, and listen to different voices. My journey continues, and I look forward to promoting social well-being as a social work student in the future.
So I'm going to now show you 3 short excerpts of some final projects. This one is by June Bay, an architectural student. Like I said, he followed Bob Pantsman, and this is an excerpt from that.
So just head on up here. Pass this street. And then the entrance to the park is right there, the 2 little stones. The parking lot right there. I think you're living up. But I'm going to get back to why we're right here in this particular place. And it's a very particular story. So given sort of all these things that have happened, and we'll fill in more pieces as we go, you've basically got, by the 1960s and 70s, a very poor black city in a very wealthy white suburb. Right? A lot of things come with poverty. Violence, crime comes with parts, part of it, right? There were so many shootings in this area during the Vietnam War that it was called Saigon, it was nicknamed Saigon Flats. The implication being there was as many shootings in here, this neighborhood, in any given day as in Vietnam. So it was a very, very tough area of town. The way I talk about this sometimes is, some people say, well, you know, people love to say, oh God, slavery's over, Jim Crow's over, what's the problem anymore, right? And that's why it's very easy to people say, oh, well, Ferguson's just about police, right? I often think about it this way. It's almost like if I took you on the edge of a cliff, right, and pushed you over, and then suddenly said, well, I'm not pushing anymore, right? And you go, but I'm still falling, right? And that's the position our culture is in right now, right? We claim we're not discriminating anymore, we claim all this stuff, but the results of it are still dropping like dominoes, right?
This is an excerpt of Getting Out, Women in Transition. by Abby Gorman.
I remember going to court September the 21st, 2001, and me and my daughter was in the kitchen. Me, my daughter, and my son, we were in the bathroom brushing our teeth. And I said, I'll see y'all when y'all get back from school. You know, I'm gonna be here when y'all come back. And that was the last time I seen my kids until, physically outside of the home until 2008. December the 15th, 2008, that was the day I came back home from December the 21st, 2001. I came out the penitentiary on October the 3rd of 1995, and that was my 5th time out of prison.
They sent me my first time in 1984 with a 2-year sentence. And I went back 10 more times, 11 total. Sometimes it'd be for a few months on a parole violation. Other times I'd have new charges and I'd get more time. But the bottom line was I ended up doing about 14 and a half years over a 20-year span.
You gotta know, I'm feeling love, made it gold. I never loved another one, another you. It's gotta be love, I said it. You gotta know.
There's been a big rise in the number of people who are in prison, and particularly women, and that began in the 60s and in the 70s when the
I'm going to stop it here because I've been given a warning of time. But what I wanted to say, I want to show you a little bit of the next one. Maybe I don't have another one. All right, I was doing a good job of making it short. Well, I'll continue. But one thing I wanted to say was that, that this is one of the oldest women, or she was one of the originators, a nun, who started this program, Women in Transition.
In the 60s and in the 70s, when the war on drugs.
I do have one more, I'm sorry. I'll show you this one. One of the things I wanted to say was that all the students,
My name is Julia Ho, and I'm a community organizer here.
none of them were art students, and they all absolutely did something quite different.
And currently I am an organizer, a community organizer.
So the way we organize an action here at Moore is we go through our research team. So the research team fuels all of the actions for the different campaigns here at Moore. So once the research team identifies a potential target or an issue or something that's actionable or something that people can take action against, then they release some sort of document that illustrates this target or issue to the general public via our social media networks and other means of communication. And as an organizer, I would figure out what type of action people would like to take through general conversation at a meeting or having one-on-one meetings with individuals. And once we poll the group, like just say if it was for Decarcerate, we would bring the actionable item to the Decarcerate meeting and say, hey, we have this issue going on in the city or this potential target that we want to take action against. And what do you guys think are some creative ways that we can address the issue and take action that will actually put pressure on the powers that be to either meet our demands or at least meet with us so we can talk about a way for them to meet our demands.
So I want to thank you, and if you'd like to see these in their full version, you can go to this Vimeo channel and see them all. Thank you very much.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay, so good afternoon to all of you, and I want to thank Harvard for having us here, sharing our research. In St. Louis, we're doing a lot, and it is very good that we are sharing this with you today. So, on the other hand, I want to also thank the Mellon Foundation, who gave me the opportunity to partner with another school in the area to make this wonderful project. So, let me try. So my studio or my course has not been taught yet. It is going to start in fall 2016. So the reason that I'm here and the reason that I'm sharing this with you is because what we are trying to look in our course is the study of segregation in the metropolitan St. Louis, both from a planning, policy, and design perspective. I am trying to look at triple bottom line imbalance that produces this built environment that we see today in St. Louis. So we all know St. Louis, and we all know the city with many, many rings of suburbs that expand towards the west. So in what we are trying to do is a mixture of two good schools in the region, again, Washington University and Harry Stowe University, with Mark Abbott being the leader from Harry Stowe. Mark is a very interesting individual. His research is about in planning. He has research planning in St. Louis, and he's very knowledgeable in the area. I met Mark in 2004, and the first time that I saw him and he was speaking about some of the issues in the area, I said, I want to work with you. So if we had the opportunity, would you work with me? And he said yes. So this was a wonderful opportunity, and I reached out. And Mark is also the director of the Center for Neighborhood Affairs at Harry Stowe University. The Neighborhood Affair Center has a lot of fellows that are both from academia, but also from nonprofit and from the government sector that contribute to the center in many ways according to the project that they bring to the center. So this is Harry Stowe, and that's WashU. We're only, let's say, 6 miles apart from each other, but we are extremely different. So let me show you that. We always talk about the Delmar divide. That's the Delmar divide, that's Delmar, and how it divides our city. But we also want to talk about the issue that is not only the Delmar divide, we have a lot of divides in the city beyond that. So our student population in WashU is very different from the one at Harry Stowe. Let me talk about this today. So as you can see, we have a lot of undergrad, and they have only, maybe a third or a fifth of what we actually have. Not only they have a very small body of students, they do not have a graduate student body. In terms of ethnicity, we have at WashU only 8% of our student body is African American. They have 83% of African Americans in their community. Our retention rate is 97%. All our students graduate. As it indicates here, their retention rate is very low. Most of the students not only study, they also work, full-time mostly. There's something also very interesting is that, of course, because they work, their graduation rate is not in 4 years, but it expands to 6 years. And of course, the number of degrees is very limited in comparison to what we are used to WashU. The annual tuition is only $4,800, so you can see what is the percentage in terms of what WashU has as a tuition. Room and board also is double at WashU almost. And what is also extraordinary, and I am conscious that my school is trying to make an effort towards this issue, is the number of Pell Grants that they have with respect of what WashU can offer. As student loans, you can see 84% of the students, not only they work, but they also are in debt by the end of their career. And in terms of the endowment of each school, you can see the numbers, they speak by themselves. So I was also very fortunate that at the same time that I was trying to create this relationship with Mark and his school, I applied to another grant that is called Bring Your Own Idea. Bring Your Own Idea is a grant offered through the Office of Provost, and what they do and encourage is for professors of different backgrounds to share information so as to produce different lines of research. So I called the Office of Provost and I asked them if it would be a good idea or okay with them if I did not expand only to the 7th school at WashU, but also all the universities in the region. I wanted to include academia, but also not academia. So I invited nonprofits to our organization. I invited churches, and we're going to talk about that in a second. I also invited with Mark a number of politicians that came and talked with us and share ideas and where we could debate in a very nice manner how we see it from academia and what is the response when you try to put it into practice. So for this, we developed a schedule during the summer 2000, it was last summer, so summer 2015. Our first launch was trying to look at causation. It was trying to look at what causes segregation in the region and how do we see it from different lines of research. How do we understand it? What is our conclusion depending on how are we approaching to the issue of segregation. We concentrate very much on the main policy decisions that have led to segregation in the region. We also had a second launch which was trying to look at the consequences of segregation. Of course, we read Place Matter, and not only we read Place Matters, we had Todd also on board. In this, we were looking at education. Education is key. You have seen it all over the place, from Jason to other people that have looked at that. We do care about education, so we raise that issue into our lunches. We also look at mitigation policy, both from the policy perspective, but also from the design perspective. I'm a designer, so we were trying to see how that influence in the built environment and what are we doing in order to change or modify those situations. So again, design practices that have been cited as perpetuating the current state of segregation in our community. We follow those with fall schedule, where we were looking specifically at issues that were rising up from the conversation that we had in the summer. So one of them was desirability of integration. Is it something that we desire, is it something that the community desires, or is it something else that they are looking? That was basically talking about American and the universal idea of the ultimate objective of this being the American housing policy and of the American public policy being integration. So we also look at what Jesus do. That was another of our conversations, where again we invited a rabbi, we invited a Lutheran minister, we invited somebody from the Catholic Church, and in the same table we had the director of sustainability of the city of St. Louis. So there was a very nice environment in the things that we discussed and the way that this was approached. And the last one was what would be the next step, correct? What does the next president of the United States need to do in order to embrace these issues that we're talking beside this? So again, I quote what I found very interesting in the New York Times. There was an article, and it was saying 50 years after the creation of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and nearly that long after the passage of Fair Housing Act of 1968, the fight against the interlinked sources of housing discrimination and racial segregation in America is far from finished. That was striking, and the article is marvelous. If you want a copy, I can give it to you, and I will be happy to share. So moving forward, I want to share what was, how did we manage to do these lunches, and what was the kind of environment that we wanted to create. So we were very specific at trying to create a lot of diversity in race, diversity in gender, in the people that came to these lunches, and also, of course, academia versus not academia. So we try to mix both worlds. This is the second. So this was the fall schedule. We have a lot of participants towards the end because it was the fall. Summer was a little bit more difficult to us, but we managed to have a very nice environment. So as a result of these conversations that we had, we actually are thinking today with Mark, and we have applied for a grant to publish our findings. We have a book that we're trying to put together that is called Conversations for Action and Collected Essays. So this is more or less what you would have seen if you were coming to one of our conversations. So there was a mixture of different schools at Washington University, but also we invited Harry Stowe University, SLU, we invited Lindenwood University, AMSL, and even Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville, which is, I would say a good 188 more or less miles from us. Somebody might correct me. So also we have the city of St. Louis involved, but we have city of Berkeley, city of Ferguson, St. Louis County. We have East-West Gateway, St. Louis, again, Cranon Catholic Church. And we also have architects in St. Louis coming to talk to us about their experience of trying to build a different kind of environment in the city. So I want to point out to some of our colleagues and some of our friends that came and spent a lunch with us talking about these issues. So Rosalind Williams, I want to point out, she was the planning director of the city of Ferguson, and she was in our first lunch. She said, you have even more segregation because the areas that they left were more integrated at the time that they were when where they ended up. That was something very interesting about how we actually keep on creating segregation more than dissolving segregation. We also have Todd Swanson coming to our second one and talking about consequences, and he said the suburb is excluded and pushed back and up and up, getting affordable housing built neither in the city nor in the suburbs. So he was talking about political issues in terms of trying to mitigate something that actually was enhanced by political issues. Mark Tranel came to our third lunch and he said, I think you have to look at the intersection of four things. Place matters, time matters, policy matters, and free market economy matters. Molly Metzer from Washington University also came, and she was talking about the Fair Housing Act and how real estate creates more segregation in our area. Sarah Coffin from SLU came and talked about federal government and the policies that are installed in the region and how those actually are counter to the creation of inclusion. We had Dwayne Smith, who is the provost for diversity and community at Harry Stowe University, talking about, and he said that his first speech actually was in one of these churches that came to one of our meetings. Andrea Boyles, who has a recent book published on segregation, and she is a lawyer actually, she said, what are the documented explanations for how segregation came to be and what data they show. She was interested in that, so she shared some of the data with us. And then we have also from Lindenwood University in criminal justice, another professor who talked to us about the way that he did not only see this in academia, but also from his experience in the judicial system. So we also had the pleasure to have with us Joseph. Joseph came to the project very at the beginning. We asked him if he would be kind to come to St. Louis and give a lecture, and he, of course, was completely on board. He gave a talk that was called More Medicine Than Fire and the Elements, and it was interesting because the reaction was like, isn't that title too much? And I said, exactly. This is what we're talking about. So he focused on looking on how policy and planning guided this ill-fated built environment that we have today. So we have designed the course in terms of what we want the student to acquire, but also what we want the community to acquire. I want to stress out that the connection with Harry Stowe gave me the platform to engage the community. Harry Stowe is an African-American Black university, and they have a very deep relationship with organizations, grassroots organizations in the region. That was one of the main reasons that we started to talk with Mark on the first place in 2004. So we wanted the students to be able to evaluate and analyze policy and planning through the framework of this triple bottom line sustainability that I talk and teach about, and to understand again the physical manifestation of segregation in the built environment. But also we want that collaboration, that transdisciplinary collaboration that is not only from the researchers, but also with the community, and especially with, again, nonprofits, organizations, and politicians in the region. So I know that I'm running out of time. So we have several outcomes that we expect to have from this course. So besides introducing the students to deep research and understanding theories and debates in current issues of segregation, we really want the students to engage in the causes and consequences of segregation in metropolitan St. Louis, but also looking at results. We want the students to be able to produce an exhibition with their with what their findings are, so we can share it with the larger community overall. Also, Mark and I, as I said, we are proposing not only a scholarly article, we're trying to find funding for our proposed book, and we are proposing also a panel discussion in the 2007 SLACO conference in St. Louis. So this is more or less, I'm going to go fast here, this is the evaluation that we are proposing for our course. As you can see, service learning is our main component. We think about service learning as, again, is not only from the structure of the Black universities, but also a structure that we want to engage in our course. And the final report is our main component, I would say, into this. Our students are going to be 24, 12 from Washington University, 12 from Harris Stowe, and they're going to create groups of 4, 2 and 2, and they are going to have mentors. As I said, the Center for Neighborhood Affairs will provide us with one design mentor and one humanity mentor, where the students can have that background information that they lack in order to, I will say, perfect or improve that research that they are conducting. We are looking to have a combination of field trips, field work, not only field trip where you look, also where we engage the community residents to be associated researchers, so they can actually be prepared or engage in the community, so they can enable this plan that we are going to produce by the end. We have a series of lectures. Most of them are going to be conducted or carried by this amazing group of faculty that came to our lunches. We have literature and textual analysis, and of course, our ultimate goal is this plan that we are going to propose for the communities. Again, we base our structure in this the same way that we did Build Your Own Idea, with the components of causation, consequences, mitigations, and then our service learning component enabling us to produce this plan. A series of readings. We spend a lot of time in our readings. Our readings are extremely multidisciplinary, and we try, instead of organizing them through disciplines, which is what we try to avoid at all costs, we try to create certain topics where we could actually place those readings for the students to conduct that research. We develop a community plan proposal where we are going to have a project description. We're going to be engaged on that community history, understanding the causes of segregation, the consequences of segregation in that community, and giving them a vision where the plan can start to grow up from. And of course, some recommendations on how that community plan could be developed. Again, remember, one of our components is also to have people trained as we are producing the research in the community, to be able to help us help them in a way, if they allow us. So the basic framework of our course, I'm not going to be here, I spent a lot of time here, but these are all the lectures that we're going to give, and we have assigned, again, professors in the area to help us with this. And I want to be very fast, because I know that I am very late already, but the understanding of the neighborhood in a city that is so porous as St. Louis, I call it the Gruyere cheese, correct? It's all bunch of holes, and then a lot of different kind of socioeconomics going on. I believe that the neighborhood is a key element, and this is what I am doing with other projects and research that I'm conducting at the moment. So again, we have the divide, north-south, but we also have this amount of neighborhoods in the area that who has very different socioeconomics. And I want to mention again, Jason showed this, the percentage of African Americans towards the north versus the south of that divide. But it's also interesting how, as we go from the west to the east, the socioeconomics also, the percentage of income also changes. So we selected those neighborhoods specifically because they produce a very nice I will say, palette of options of different neighborhoods and different ways that we live in our community in St. Louis. So as you can see, this is East St. Louis. It was mentioned today. We are looking right now, and the neighborhood was already mentioned today, to narrow into a specific community in East St. Louis. Of course, you can see the area is a lot larger than for the West End or the Central West End or Tower Grove South, if you wish. We also look at Florissant. We look at Tower Grove South, Central West End, the West End, and Kirkwood. So this was my presentation. So thank you very much for having me here.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank Daniel Diocha. As close as I can get to that. For inviting me here. I want to thank Harvard for having this discussion. You guys have no idea how important this is for St. Louis. The fact that Harvard is talking about St. Louis has a whole lot of people nervous in St. Louis. So thank you for that. As Daniel mentioned, I am the executive director of something called the Sweet Potato Project, and I'll give you the 1-minute description. We take kids from the inner city, they plant sweet potatoes on vacant lots, we give them a summer job, 10 weeks. We teach them marketing, branding, product development, sales, and teamwork. At the end of 10 weeks, these kids turn the produce into a product. So right now they're selling sweet potato cookies that you can buy at sweetpotatoprojectstl.com. The whole idea is to teach them that, number one, they're responsible for their communities. They're responsible for creating opportunities for their peers and their siblings. The bigger picture, again, we grow food on vacant lots, we have one product. The bigger picture is what happens when there's massive growing of food in North St. Louis? What happens when people own some of the 8,000 vacant lots in St. Louis and they're growing food? What happens when the whole city starts to buy products, produce and products made in North St. Louis? What happens when Washington University, right now St. Louis University buys all the sweet potatoes we can grow. We started an initiative where regular folks can get the land, grow the food. St. Louis University will buy the sweet potatoes. What happens when they buy all the produce we make? What happens when we're not just doing sweet potato cookies, where we're doing pies and we're doing canned goods? And this is how you change a community. This is how you empower people to direct their own destiny. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that and the problem that stops us from empowering regular people. And I told you this for two reasons. One, I heard that the people in Cambridge love to donate all their money to worthy causes. Two, I think that, and I don't mean to sound arrogant, but I think that what I'm onto is the solution for real progress in St. Louis. So I'm here to talk to you about the most pervasive, corrosive, and consistent malady that holds our region in a vice-like grip. It's the condition that led to the events in Ferguson. It's the condition that placed our region, and rightly so, under the international microscope. If you look at my Facebook page, you'll see that I wrote a commentary recently that speaks to the segregated mindset of our region and explains the lack of racial progress and planned exclusion in our region. How many of you have seen the documentary film, The Pruitt-Igoe Myth? Show of hands. Wonderful. That film tells you, will explain to you where we are and where we're going. So if you look at it again, the film points out that the same federal dollars that led to the building of Pruitt-Igoe and other public housing complexes was also used to create these, some of these small suburban towns like Ferguson. Thousands of units in St. Louis were raised in the 1950s to revitalize downtown St. Louis and entire neighborhoods and highways in the city and county. One of those areas was the Mill Creek Valley area. 80,000 African Americans lived there. There were 800 businesses in Mill Creek. Mill Creek was destroyed for downtown development. In 1950, St. Louis's peak population was almost 1 million people, 857,796. 20 years later, almost 500,000 people left St. Louis. St. Louis, I contend that St. Louis political leaders and their city planners never got over that exodus. And to this day, they are trying to find ways to bring a lot of those people, forgive me, white people, working class people, back to St. Louis. They won't admit it, they won't talk about it, but that's the goal. Remember, I said earlier, planned exclusion. What makes St. Louis a champion player in this exclusionary arena is that it adopted and exacerbated a philosophy of exclusion well into the 21st century. In the early 1970s, 2 St. Louis aldermen came up with board bills aimed at turning the city around. Black leaders were offended that these board bills, Bills 19 and 20, defined Black St. Louis, AKA North St. Louis, as an insignificant residential area not worthy of special maintenance effort. The bill never passed. But 2 years later, city planners hired a consultant team who came up with something called the Team 4 Plan. If you Google Team 4, thank you. Alderman Antonio French wrote one of the best summaries of Team 4. So Google it and look it up. I'll just give you a little bit of it. The study in 1974 recommended that the city adopt a policy of benign neglect. In other words, leave North St. Louis alone for 30 years, then come back and redevelop it. Now, no, it never happened. We never officially adopted Team 4. But ironically, by coincidence, 30 years later, North St. Louis is the epicenter of community development. There was a program, a plan called the North Side Regeneration Plan. A rich North St. Peter's developer, about 10 miles from St. Louis, came up with this plan, said, I want to redevelop North St. Louis near Pruitt-Igoe, and the mayor and other city planners just threw millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars at him. Still hasn't happened yet. They're holding out for the Geospatial Mapping Agency near Pruitt-Igoe. We decided to give them all the land they want. This week, the mayor announced that he's giving 47 acres to a company out of Chicago so they can grow and sell trees in North St. Louis. So St. Louis always looks for the big box, the savior, to save North St. Louis. And they always say, we'll build these things and they'll make money and it'll trickle down to the city. The problem is, rarely do they build these things and the people who live there now remain there. By intent or by mistake, you raise the property values, you increase security, and we move. For the past 115 years, African Americans have been moved from Mill Creek to one area to another area to another area. We've been forced out to places like Ferguson where we weren't always welcome or invited to be included in the economic mainstream. We were seen as people that you could run the city off of. We'll make money off of you, but we won't invest in you. So when we talk about all our plans, we have to keep in mind the segregated mindset of St. Louis. I say that this happened in the 21st century. We had a chance, an opportunity to grow up in 1993. 2 very prominent white politicians were running for mayor. They split the vote. So in 1993, St. Louis elected its first African-American mayor, Vernon Bosley Jr. A week later, city leaders, powerful city planners, powerful funders, they started putting together a campaign for Bosley's opponent, who was an African-American police chief. The reason I went to the Post-Dispatch, I wrote this essay detailing how the Post-Dispatch covered this black mayor differently from any other mayor before or after. They wrote about his mother's parking tickets. They wrote about who he went out with, the backgrounds of the people he had on his staff. They wrote about his $50,000 basketball scandal, which people, that's the reason we got rid of him. The Central Corridor, the so-called liberal voters in St. Louis, helped get this second mayor in office, Mayor Harmon. The city was, again, they were freaked out because there's something called the Board of Estimate and Apportionment. They decide where all the money goes. So you had a black mayor, and it's 3 seats, the mayor, the comptroller, and the president of the Board of Aldermen. So you had a black mayor, had a black comptroller, and a black alderwoman running for the president of the Board of Aldermen. They lost their minds. Oh my God, there goes our power. So they funded and funded and funded another candidate. They pressured Mayor Bowsley to vote for this white candidate, put hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars behind this candidate. That candidate is our current mayor, Francis Slay, became president of the Board of Aldermen. Now, I'm not saying Francis was part of the conspiracy, but ironically, when he went into office, one of the first things he did in 2001 was to break up the largest voting ward, the 20th ward in North St. Louis. Broke it up. The alderwoman lost her job. It was a way of voter disenfranchisement, but we don't talk about that. So here we are today, trying to revitalize St. Louis, but we still have this idea that it has to come from somebody white, some big box entity like the IKEA store or like the geospatial mapping agency. It has to come from there. What we are missing is what I learned by working with these kids in North St. Louis. What they're missing is what Daniel's group learned when they came to St. Louis. They came to look at this project along Martin Luther King Boulevard called Beloved Streets. The first thing they did was talk to people on the street. They talked to business owners. I forgot the lady's name who had the alteration store. But and I talked to the kids, and they were saying, man, people love this neighborhood. As dilapidated, as poor as it is, they love their communities. That's the key. Ladies and gentlemen, our kids are brilliant. No matter how they're defined in the news, they are brilliant. The kids who were involved with the Ferguson protests were the most creative, resilient. I mean, the die-ins, the slogans, the I can't breathe, the, my mind just left me, but a lot of the slogans that Black Lives Matters. When they were told they couldn't march down Florissant, they went downtown to the football game. They went to the symphony. I've heard at least 30 Mike Brown songs, and 20 of them were good. What would have happened? Keep in mind, we raised $16 million to try to keep the Cardinals in St. Louis. We're at $1 billion. A year after Mike Brown's death, the focus of our conversation was how are we going to build a $1 billion football stadium? After all the studies that you did, after all the disparity work that the Ferguson Commission did, our conversation was, how are we going to build a stadium? What an insult. What would have happened if we'd given the Black Lives Matters kid $500,000 and said, I challenged you to create some businesses? So bringing this back around to me, folks, the only answer, we will never cede or slow down poverty, crime, drug use, until we empower the people to do it and sustain it themselves. We can't give people freedom. We can't give people independence. We have to make, we black folks in St. Louis need to win. And Antonio's on the right path with his North Area campus. We need an economic piece. We need to be like when I was a kid. Walk outside my door and there was a black funeral director. There was a black pharmacist. There were black people I could look up to who said, kid, you got something special. Let me show you how I did what I did. We need that again. Black folks need to understand that they can make their own difference. And I will ask you guys questions about that. Are we involving the regular, ordinary people? Are we coming up with plans that will empower people to take care of their own communities? Again, I want you to imagine massive growing in North St. Louis, a food brand coming out of North St. Louis, mothers, fathers, children working together in their own neighborhoods. They walk into a grocery store and they see, wow, mama, that's a project we made in North St. Louis. Lift their esteem. Let them know that they can dream. Let them know that they can make a difference. My kids, I always have to turn down about 30 kids every year because my kids tell their siblings and their friends about us. So I have kids who want to do this. They get it. My kids understand. When I talk to them about building their communities, they get it. And I think they get it because no one ever talks to them like that. They show them from the negative position. They don't ever tell them, you are the solution. So, 2 minutes, I got it. Jasmine Aber, you guys know her, the architect, Cell in St. Louis? Jasmine came to my class and had my kids draw up the Sweet Potato Project building and neighborhood, and they did it. Blew me away. They had an idea for recreation. They had the building with quotes from African Americans on the walls. They had a recreation center. They had a library and a study center because this architect asked them to dream, and they responded. So our priorities are out of whack. St. Louis today, you know, I know they're trying to make changes, but their priorities are out of whack. They're not investing in the people. That's the only solution. So with that, I'm going to stop, and thank you so very much.
What time do we have? 2:59. 1 minute? But we started 10 minutes late, so give us a minute. Okay. Well, that was just really, really inspiring. And I barely know where to start, but let me just start by thanking everyone for giving such thoughtful presentations. I have a million questions, but Sylvester, and I want to turn it over to the audience primarily, but I would love to get a response from Sylvester. You know, this panel's about exposing exclusion, and this is something that you've been doing sort of tirelessly for years, and I think you've got a sort of, you've become known as a trusted authority on the topic. And I just wonder, given what you heard today, if you can say, and I think today what's been interesting today is we've heard so much, a mixture of just despair and hope, right? We've seen in so many of the presentations, we see so much of the history and are so dispirited, but at the same time, we've seen the potential of protest, of projects like the Sweet Potato Project, or the potential for data, in the case of Jason's project, or the potential of students to burst through the bubble, right? And I guess my question is, are you given what you saw today, are you hopeful?
Yes. I'm hopeful. I mean, the academia approach is needed, and I respect it. You have to research. My question to you, if you accept my philosophy of a segregated mindset, how the heck are we going to do what you want to do if we've got people who are so ingrained in this idea of exclusion based on fear?
Not me.
That's really I think it's all of you. Yeah, Jason, it's you.
You look like you were looking at me.
I'm looking at you.
I mean, I'm a psychologist by training, so the notion that we have to overcome some pretty basic modes of thinking in order to get this work done is absolutely necessary. But, you know, the approach that we've taken is, and this may be controversial, we don't have time for white consciousness to one by one become aware of these disparities and somehow through magnanimity overcome these things. So that's part of the reason why we tell the story the way that we tell it. It's about self-interest. It's about the fact that these disparities are costing the region. If I could, my kind of holy grail metric would be, this is the household level cost, because people are paying a premium for segregation. There's no reason why houses should cost as much as they do in Clayton and the Central West End in St. Louis. People are paying a premium to maintain segregated spaces. And I don't think you change policy without changing a narrative that includes people's self-interest. It's got to be a both-and conversation. There's got to be policy, there's got to be pressure coming from protests, but you're also going to have to tell a story about what's in this for me if you're going to have any real meaningful political movement.
The question really wasn't aimed at just at you, but Does Washington University, Harris Stowe, the other prestigious universities in St. Louis, are they doing this stuff in a vacuum? Or are they actually working with people, community activists, folks on the street, folks in the community? What's our responsibility, and how can you empower us to carry out our responsibility? Anybody?
Okay. If you ask me, as I said, in all our lunches, we did not involve academia by itself. We tried to do a good mixture of academia and non-academia, and we involve politicians. We involve, as you saw, planners from different cities. We involve the Creative Exchange Lab. We invited you, actually, and you couldn't come. There was a lot of people from different sectors who actually are trying to produce that change. So, and again, in my case, I was fortunate to meet Mark, and he enabled us through the center to access to those grassroots nonprofits in the region. So again, that's what we're trying. We're also engaged with SLACO very much, which SLACO, for everybody that is not from St. Louis, is an organization that networks and combines all the neighborhoods in the region. And it's a very interesting setting what they have. And they come to SLACO to try to produce plans, to try to look what was successful in one part of the region versus another, and why is it that things are not exactly linear in a way.
One last question. What responsibility does Washington University, St. Louis University, some of our other prestigious Harris Stowe University, what percentage of the responsibility do these universities have in the segregation in St. Louis? You don't have to answer that, I know.
That could be a question for our St. Louis historians too, right? Anyone want to take the bait?
How much land SLU got from urban Mill Creek Valley, right?
Right. So I guess I've answered my own question. It's not that I'm doubting your efforts now, but the universities in St. Louis are just as responsible as the government officials in exclusion and segregation in St. Louis. So how do we really address that mindset? It's hard for universities to do what they do without having political partners. People who's going to fund and do what you're going to do and give you the money. So I'm just a little concerned about that dynamic. How can you make these changes without offending the people who fund you and give you land and all these other things?
I think that just by thinking that Washington University has Adrian working in Ferguson Seed Fund, or having the Mellon Foundation allow us to reach to these very generous grants to produce this research, that again, in my case, I am extremely fortunate not only to be working on this grant, but we working with so many institutions across the region. I think that speaks a lot of my school.
And I think you have to complicate what you mean by when you say Washington University. Denise is Washington University, I'm Washington University. We're not some monolithic castle on the hill, although we're often perceived that way in the community. There are people who make up Washington University whose work is rooted in communities, working with communities. Those 100 stakeholders that I mentioned bringing together were not academics. Those were community folks trying to make a difference in St. Louis every day. So Washington University, and any institution of its size, is a complex institution that bears some responsibilities as well. And I'll be the first one to say that.
And I'd also like to add that, you said it yourself, that those young people were brilliant. This conversation needs to be happening with them, not just with a group of people who absolutely already pretty much know this. We're filling in some of the gaps by people have different pockets of information. But those young people, if they really understood what has been suppressed knowledge-wise, I think they would absolutely be able to plan and to fight, to understand the importance of voting, understand the importance of being a civic leader, understand the idea, what does being a a citizen absolutely mean? How do you decipher the difference between what's being told to you and reconcile that with what you see in your neighborhood? I think this conversations like this need to be happening outside of academia. And I go to these kinds of conversations at the History Museum. All of those kinds of conversations are packed with people. They just need, I think they also need younger people. Somehow maybe we need to just like go into the schools and just take it to them.
Well, you know, I agree with you, but I need to push back a little bit. Our young kids get it. They understand that their lives don't matter. They understand that walking to school could mean a death sentence. It's on us, the adults, the institutions, the government agencies, to give them direction. I'm no genius, but I give kids direction that inspires them. So it's on us, to me, to see where they are, what they believe in, what excites them, and build on that. And that means money. That means research. That means direction. So I agree with you. There's work to do, but our kids are kids. They need us to make this stuff make sense, and to give them the opportunities to make their own ideas make sense.
So we're going to have to continue this discussion over the reception, because we've got a lot to talk about here. But I see a couple of hands up, and I want to make sure we get some chance for audience questions. Yep.
Just a quick question. In terms of all the disparities that were discussed, what are some of the barriers currently preventing, poor parts of St. Louis from enjoying any kind of equity, enjoying any kind of income or any kind of resources? Because to say that there's an absence of resources in North City doesn't tell us why there's an absence. And it couldn't just be about the politicians and the institutions, but there's something as a whole that's not really working for St. Louis. It seems like there's like a pie, right? But the pie is so small, I don't know how we actually divide it up to ensure that people have more resources and more access. So what are some of the barriers that we can then dismantle for the benefit of people who are poor or poorly resourced?
I mean, I think we've spent most of the morning talking about what they are. It's segregation. Segregation is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and it is what distributes resources in terms of education, in terms of home equity, in terms of wealth, in terms of all of those things. It's what organizes our community, and to break that down as a barrier, you're going to have to reverse engineer 100 years of housing policy.
Okay, so I guess just to make a clearer question, can we figure out specifically what sort of organizations, what sort of people, what sort of things that are continuing or perpetuating this barrier for more equity? So getting beyond the abstract of segregation, because that's basically like another way of saying that white people don't want to live with black people, but specifically if there are rich white people within or black people within the city of St. Louis, that's a municipality, and there's some distribution of resources in terms of taxation for those individuals. What existing barriers are there now that are redirecting the resources or preventing a bigger pie for equitable distribution of resources in St. Louis City? So just getting beyond the abstract, what are some actual concrete things that are stopping us from achieving greater equity within the city?
I think MK works on two levels. I think that African Americans were distracted by the passage of the civil rights legislation. We thought our salvation, our opportunities were outside our communities. First step is we got to go back. We got to go back in time when we had no choice but to depend on ourselves. We have to use our wealth, and we are very, very wealthy people, African Americans compared to some other countries, invest our wealth into our communities. Secondly, the white community has got to stop being afraid of the black community. We've got to come into the community, shop in those stores, eat in their restaurants, go to their musical productions. So we need a healthy, vibrant African American community and bold, progressive whites who will come and support the entities of that community. And really, I'm sorry, it goes back to what Daniel and his group of students did when they came to St. Louis. They looked at the whole Martin Luther King strip, and they gave him the notion that we can empower that strip. So we have a project. Let's empower Martin Luther King. Let's make that our focus. Let's empower Martin Luther King. Let's create a cultural district like we have at Grand Center. Let's create restaurants, small businesses. Let's find a way to get these kids operating small businesses. And then everybody in St. Louis gets on board.
But there's more to this, I think. One of the things is to create equity, you also need to protect equity, which means I think that what you are saying is a great idea. However, if you do not protect the tipping point, then that African American community will be a white community soon. So I think that that is key in enabling the African American community to grow. I was in a panel with Joseph and Jonathan Smith, and Jonathan was asking directly in the panel, he said, move to my community, move to my African American community. And one of the debates that went on was, okay, I moved to your community, but I don't want the tipping point to occur, so you need to live out the community, or your neighbors need to live from that community. So I think that in terms of housing is key.
That's a crucial point, and it goes in both directions. You can look at literature that shows if a neighborhood is 40% African American, it's perceived as disorganized, even by African Americans. I don't know how you overcome that in terms of if your very person signals disorder and disorganization. That's something, forgive me, that's psychological. That's not a political process. That's something you've got to get over in your own thinking. And it goes, we worry about gentrification, but you also need to worry about if we're really going to be committed to integrated spaces, there's going to have to be a change in mindset. It's got to be psychology and politics.
I just want to say, I think, and this is just me, that we can't wait on academia or white folks to save us. I'll give you an example. We need black politicians to look at North St. Louis and say, this area here is the one we're going to reestablish. Paul McKee's North Side Regeneration Project. The man accumulated 1,500 acres of land. He went to the politicians who wrote legislation for him to get millions and millions and millions of dollars. We have politicians, we have empty land, let's do this. In Kansas City, there is a Kansas City agriculture bill that we could very well apply. That changes the code for whole areas, whole blighted areas. It changes it from commercial and residential to agriculture. And it makes millions and millions and millions of dollars available to that zone. Bet your bottom dollar that Paul McKee is going to apply for that money. My challenge to African American aldermen and politicians, let's claim our land, let's write the legislation, and let's take the lead in improving our communities. Then WashU and other corporations can come behind to bolster and reinforce our lead.
So Don and then Jamila. Yeah.
So is this on?
No.
So the point I want to make is something that goes along like this. I have a certain feeling I should begin my comments to this group as my name is Don Rowe. I'm a public official from St. Louis, and I have a problem and want to enter into the 12-step program. I won't do it that way because many of you know I work in St. Louis, and we have a great mission to achieve things better for our community, all across the community. I made a reference before we broke earlier that tomorrow there's a big decision, and I made a reference to it is that there's going to be a punch to it, and here's my concern to the punch is this is about the fact that Jimmy Carter made an executive order that the federal government, and we haven't really talked about the federal government much today, is supposed to do things to maintain the health of urban areas, particularly in the locations of their facilities. And the situation we have is they're closing. The feds are closing a facility in St. Louis, National Geospatial, that has 3,100 jobs in it. And they've gone out to the marketplace to look for new sites. And tomorrow, there'll be an announcement. And the announcement will be regarding 4 sites that the Corps of Engineers has evaluated and ranked for NEPA, and the National Geospatial Agency will make a selection. There's a horse race, really, between 2 sites. And I'll reference the presentation before lunch, where there was talk, the last map was about sprawl in St. Louis, is that we have the highest coefficient of sprawl of any metropolitan area in the country. And choice number one, not choice number one. One of the two choices in the horse race is locating this National Geospatial facility in Illinois at exit 19 on the interstate at a cornfield. That seems to be in that sprawl map. If they go there, that's a pretty good solid punch to the head. I'm the Director of Planning and Urban Design for the City of St. Louis, so I don't want it to go there. I think that's bad for our region. The second thing I just want to allude to is, as we talked about a little bit before the break, is the feds in the looking for their site have been sort of monolithic in how they want to design the site. So the urban design of this particular federal installation, as they envision it now, in our city is not the greatest. It's not a blow to the head, but it's a little gut-wrenching to have the feds do that. That all happens tomorrow. It'll be happening before the end of the day tomorrow that they'll make their announcement, and we'll know the result of that. Hopefully, if the result is that it stays in the city of St. Louis, we will, and hopefully some of the voices here can help get the design of that facility to be better for fitting in the urban fabric that we have. So that's just what I wanted to point out from my comments from earlier.
Thank you.
Well, Don, let me first say this here. It's good that, we will have the NGA in the St. Louis area, but the question that all of us should be asking today is how many of those jobs will go towards African Americans to change the dynamics that we're talking about? Mm-hmm. We're talking a lot about everything, okay? And we have some simple fix. We have children, if you take Black Lives Matter, they rose up because of the shooting of Michael Brown. But do you know how many kids that are literally walking dead because of the public school system? If you want to change the dynamics of poor Black kids, you have to first educate them, or you're going to incarcerate them. You're going to send them to Penn State, or you're going to send them to the state pen. There's no in between. And so you have to begin to rise up against a system that's destroying poor Black kids. You have children in the St. Louis area that cannot read and write, and they're passing them knowing that they cannot read and write. Many of them are on below proficiency in every subject matter. So when you talk about jobs and how you get them to where they need to be, they're not even able to compete in the global economy when you talk math and science. And that's the new, that's Orange is the New Black, math and science. And so we also have a dynamic that 20% of poor Black men in the city of St. Louis are unemployed. 20% unemployment in the Black community with Black men. And that's one reason is because they have made mistakes in the past. They go out and they knock on the doors of opportunities, and the doors are slammed in their faces before they even walk in, because they walk in in the door with the stigma of being an ex-felon. So we have to begin to change policies in order to change lives. And a lot of the lives that have been affected is due to policies that have been implemented for over the last 70 years. And I'm just, on my soapbox, but MK was onto something. How do we get here? How do we get out of it? And the first thing first, we have to turn the educational system, the St. Louis public school system, upside down. We need to be marching like we marched when that young Black man got killed in Ferguson. We need to be marching on the system. Thank you.
But hold on one second. But in order to change the educational system, you also have to feed the kids. When you go to and I have done research in the schools of St. Louis, and when you go and you know that 40% of those kids are homeless and they do not have a proper meal before going to class, the education doesn't matter really because they cannot absorb the education. So also, it is extremely important what you were saying, that this is, besides education, that he said, if number one, you also need to give food to those kids.
And you need to tell the children the truth. A lot of times when we get these history books out of Texas, they have changed the truth. And the truth needs to be told. how we got to where we are today through segregation. Why is a young black man a boogeyman? Why? You know, I've got students at school, at university, they walk into a room and people fear them. Why? What is the psychological thing going on there? Is it guilt? I mean, I don't know. I mean, yes, I have a theory. That doesn't mean it's true. But the truth needs to be told to these young people of why they are in the state they are in. And because they've always been blamed for who they are because that's where they are.
Absolutely. To the senator's point, which is, I think, absolutely right, we're not going to get to jobs if we don't have people with skills to fill those jobs. But the problem is we've been trying to innovate instruction and hope that that changes educational disparities. There's a new instructional paradigm every week. Education is being reformed every week. That's not the problem. The problem is children don't have an opportunity to learn if they're hungry, if they can't see, if they can't hear, if they're traumatized, if they're dealing with the effects of toxic stress, which we know is changing the actual architecture of their brains, the portions of their brains that are in charge of executive function and memory. So if we're actually going to change those educational disparities, instruction is the last thing we worry about. The first thing you worry about is, do you have a place to sleep? Have you had enough to eat? Can you see? Can you hear? And then we'll talk about reading, writing, and arithmetic. That's the thing that needs to be turned on its head. Every child needs to be wrapped around, particularly children in the most vulnerable school districts, needs to be wrapped around with a set of resources, and then we get to instruction. And that's part of what we're talking about when we talk about the whole school, whole child, whole community model, which we want to see seeded throughout the St. Louis region, but start in the highest need school districts. So there are, to MK's question, there are very tangible, very concrete strategies that we're trying to marshal stakeholders from around the St. Louis region around, but it takes work. This isn't just, have a day-long event and clap hands and we're done. This takes sustained effort and information. It can be fun to beat up on academia, but the more constructive thing is to say, how can we partner with communities to provide the kind of information that they need in order to advocate for the things that matter to them? And that's what we've been trying to do.
So, Patty, I know you have a question, and I'm sure it's a great one, but we're just out of time. So maybe later you can ask the panelists a question, maybe over the reception. I just want to say how incredibly inspired I am by the work you all do, and it's amazing. And I think this panel has been a sort of indictment of the topic. It's clearly not enough to expose exclusion, right? The work you all doing is not just exposing it, but actually doing the hard work of getting that knowledge and that data into the right people's hands, getting the right conversations going, and turning this knowledge we have into meaningful change. And so I'm just really inspired by it all. And just keep doing amazing things. And thank you for taking time out of your schedule to come here.
Thank you.